Hello, and welcome to another CANTV edition of Chicago Corner, where we cover the stories from across our 77 neighborhoods that make Chicago the greatest city in the nation because of its neighborhoods and its people. I'm very, very excited to welcome to our show this evening Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez, who is one of our progressive aldermen in Chicago City Council, and I have followed your career and your service to the city, and I'm a big fan and admirer of your work. And I got to say, anybody that can trigger Mayor Lightfoot in a city council meeting has got to be doing something right. So I wanted to take your visiting us tonight as an opportunity to share a little bit more with our Chicago audience, your personal history, some of your personal story, what brought you to Chicago, and led to your service as alderperson of the 25th Ward. I understand you're originally from Ecuador, and you came to the United States for education purposes. Correct. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought you here to serve the good people of Chicago?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So yeah, indeed, when I came in as a teenager at 17 years old, in circumstances that were a little outside what I would imagine even. I would never probably thought I was going to be one day an alderman. I was 17, probably didn't know what it was. But I came, as a teenager. At the time, my family, we got into a car accident. That's really what triggered that. We got stuck with bills, medical bills and all that. So we went from like a middle class family doing okay to now struggling with bills. And, so, at the time, my mom, my parents, we got through some really difficult times. And my mom just one day decided, said, look, the things are rough in the country. We got high inflation, talk about these times, I think our inflation at the time was reaching like 500%, So we have some, these neoliberal experiments. I've lived them, and I see what it does, what it do to communities. Yeah. So, Ecuador, was considered, I would say almost a colony. We have a military base of the U.S. We lost our currency. We have the U.S. dollar. So the neoliberal experiment did a lot of damage to us. A lot of the things that we see in Chicago,
as well as here in the United States.
Right. I mean, it's across the board, right? So, and I think we got to see, there's a lot more in common between people, right? And not so much between governments, right? And I think that's what I think, in my opinion, the service on public service is so critical, especially now, to make sure that people have safety nets, right? I think that for us, when I came in as a teenager, again, in these circumstances, I came in an interesting time. I was in 2001 when the 9/11 happened. I came that summer. Wow. And immigration changed completely, after that. I think the world entirely, changed after that. And I came to a small town in Tennessee, as an exchange student, as part. And again, I ended up in a last-minute trip, with, taking the little savings that my family had coming to the U.S. So in Tennessee, I arrived as a exchange student, and I was part of a program called the American Field Service that President Kennedy. AFS.
I went at my high school. I was involved in that program. That's interesting.
There you go.
We host foreign students for the experience in the United States.
Exactly.
That's amazing. That's great.
And what's with the idea of service was an exchange, right? So, right. People travel. And I think that, it is a valuable, super valuable experience, to learn and understand each other, right? Absolutely. There's a lot to hear and learn from, different perspectives across the world, I think that, those barriers, frontiers and borders are imaginary. There's really, at the end of the day, we're human beings. And, I think international policy, what we see right now in wars and unnecessary wars, that are really about profit, about money. They're not about people or helping, keeping anyone safe, but really about those wars that are really profitable for some people, very costly for others, So when I came here to, and I see the devastation, right, of wars, what happened in Iraq, what's happening in Afghanistan, what's now happening in Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine. What we see in time after time, is really this military spending not ending, and I think that it was an interesting time to be here again in 2001 when I came here in a world that was very different. In Tennessee was very different for me. But I learned very quickly, I was a host family that really host me. I'm really forever thankful. The host mother, Carmen, who was an African American studies professor, taught me quite a bit about, the reality that we live in, right? Yeah. The injustices, right? And learning, and quickly I learned, about the civil rights movements, right? About the history and, the history that we need to learn for us not to repeat it again. So for us, the concept of international solidarity, right? Because I think many people, as another immigrant, right? Chicago's, made of immigrants. So Polish immigrants, Latinx people, African immigrants. We're really such a melting pot. Chicago is one of the most diverse cities in the world and has what you said earlier, right? The hardest working people in the country, right? So many hardworking people. And again, when I migrated here was because the family in Tennessee had roots here. In Chicago. So I visited the first time in 2001 and I was forever in love, with what I saw. In fact, when I graduated from college, that's the first stop that I made. I put back my bags, at the time, the economy in Tennessee was very different, and, remember 2006 when I came to Chicago and, I always saw, the opportunity, for immigrants, communities like I represent now, like Pilsen, Chinatown, that have been the port of entry for immigrants like me for generations. And to see, the community that embraces us and sees the humanity on us, right? That is something that I think in these times is being lost, right? We see the dehumanization of immigrant communities, Black communities, you name it, and, at the core of it, I think that we need to start looking at at each other with that human face, right? We're all human beings. And I think that's what really brought me to politics, when we saw like the closing of schools and the Rahm Emanuel, right?
Oh, yeah. And mental health clinics.
The mental health clinics. These neoliberal experiments, right? Again, I grew up in a poor country, we've seen the devastation, when, the big corporations and the banking industry, takes away from the poor, the devastation it creates. Here in Chicago, I've seen the same thing.
And redistributes to the rich.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the rich never lose. Look at,
never. They're the ones getting all the socialism. They're the ones getting all the corporate handouts while, everyone else who needs some kind of a safety net is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, Absolutely. You need to have boots first. And when you're giving all the boots to all of the elites, it makes it a little bit difficult for the hardworking person to scratch ahead.
Absolutely. Look, in terms of like immigrant communities like Pilsen or Chinatown or, we have, the 25th ward in a way is a microcosm of the city, right? Because we represent the West Loop, South Loop, Abla Homes, which is a very strong enclave of the African-American community in Chicago, that is being gentrified as well, right? We have big developers, taking over, entire neighborhoods, blocks, and, that we cannot accept that as the norm because it takes away the very essence. You mentioned, right? What I think the show does, highlights the neighborhoods, the 77 neighborhoods, and the beauty that we have in our communities is something that we must treasure and value. Developers, corporations don't see that. They just see dollar signs. We see people, right? We see the safety nets. We see the value, right? That is oftentimes commodified, right? By developers and those corporations. And when we see the inequities and those safety nets being taken away, we got to see the suffering, right? When they close the 50 schools, right? People talk about violence, but, we're forgetting about the 50 schools that Rahm Emanuel closed. Yeah. I think that's at the core of a lot of...
We're still reeling from all of that.
We're reeling the mental health clinics that you mentioned.
And the focus has to be more on uniting we're the most hyper-segregated city in the world, unfortunately. Yep. And, different neighborhoods, great, representing different cultures, but I almost feel like those in power work at keeping people divided as opposed to what you're talking about and what we like to see, uniting people against the neoliberal agenda, against the neoliberal forces that aren't really helping or providing the type of support for the hardworking citizens of the city.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We see a city, like you said, it's socialism for the rich, and it works very well, and austerity for the poor, right? So,
well, let me interrupt you really quickly. We're seeing this with the casino that we have money for, but money not for the mental health clinics. We're going to be bringing NASCAR, and we'll talk about all this. NASCAR, we've got money, they're going to pay a pittance for those licenses without getting any feedback from the community.
Absolutely.
There's the danger of a lot of local businesses being damaged by the casino and by these new industries. Lightfoot was overseas courting fintech companies to bring all this money to Chicago, right? To support tourism. But suddenly when we ask, where's the money to invest in our neighborhoods? We're broke. We know we're not broke.
Right.
But this is the heart of the problem: the neoliberal experiment, or the neoliberal what do we call it? Not experiment, but agenda, plan.
It is, the new liberals, right? The neoliberals, right?
Can you explain really quickly for our audience? Let's talk about what neoliberalism is, just as brief as we can, so we understand how that frames what we're talking about.
And I think the neoliberal experiment, I would say, because these are experiments that are conceptualized as theoretical frameworks that are absolute truths, right? And very rarely get challenged. But look at, the perfect example of neoliberalism, and one of the probably is going to be one of the biggest scams in history, when the whole Wall Street gets bailed out in 2009.
Yes.
Right? 2008. This is going to be the biggest transfer of wealth, from working people to the banks.
We also saw it during COVID.
And during COVID, we see it. So these are the experiments that happen oftentimes that get rationalized. So neoliberalism, brings...
Jobs will trickle down.
The trickle-down economics.
We give money to the corporations and the businesses to stay a business and stay afloat. Ultimately, they'll start hiring people, and it'll help. And since Reagan, that hasn't worked. And what's interesting to me, too, is this neoliberalism, I believe, started with Reagan and Thatcher and has been embraced by the Democrats. It came from Republicans.
Right.
The Democrats now, they're Republicans they're Republicans in Democrats' clothing, the way that I see it. Yeah. I see so many Democrats. I think our current Democrats are those that wanted to avoid the extreme religious conservative wackos of the Republican Party, but wanted to embrace business and all of those policies that are still going to line their pockets from their donors and serve their business interests while everybody else gets screwed.
Absolutely.
Sadly.
And look at this trickle-down economics. You mentioned Mayor Lightfoot, right? They believe in this trickle-down. Let's invest in downtown, and because downtown is going to be doing well, it will trickle down to the neighborhoods.
It never does.
It never does. I mean, these are theories that there's a failed experiments, and we got to start talking about that. These models have never worked. I tell you, it's difficult for someone like Mayor Lightfoot or Rahm Emanuel and all these, different spectrums of neoliberals to persuade people who have lived through and endured the sufferings of neoliberal experiments when vast amount of wealth that transfer from poor or working class communities to rich, and whole industries, corporations, you name it, Wall Street, for instance, right? So this model of trickle-down economics simply doesn't work. In fact, when you mentioned, right, when it comes about casinos, when it talks about giving corporations tax incentives, tax breaks, there's always money. There's always money, all sorts of money.
Or trying to keep the Bears at Soldier Field.
Right. A $2 billion giveaway, right, to just keep
like the McCaskies don't have any money.
Exactly. So and that is actually when they demonize socialism. I'm not socialist. I think probably one of the few socialist alderpersons in the council. And when we look at socialism and what socialism actually is, we talk about Social Security. We talk about the safety nets that we have.
We have socialism.
Public education, right?
The police department, the fire department.
These are public safety nets.
These are social, we often, too many Americans don't travel to recognize how socialism works in other countries like Canada,
right?
Like France, like very, very wealthy and affluent areas of the EU. And it always comes down to everybody complaining about Medicare for all, or saying that, I think that we're indoctrinated with this for-profit healthcare system, which is a whole other subject we could talk about. But it's always accused of being socialism, and socialism is always equal to communism. And it's no, they're socialistic democracies. Right. And that's where people who have been indoctrinated can't understand that they're separate, and they're already serving us in good ways. Unfortunately, neoliberals and Republicans and conservatives are trying to take more of that away from the common person and give it more to the corporations and the ruling elites.
Look, if someone for people to understand, someone like Bernie Sanders, right? Maybe in Europe, we'll consider him moderate, right?
Yeah.
And here he's considered a radical that must be taken down from office, right? Same thing we see in city council, right? The demonization of socialists and that we are the center of all the problems when have we adopted any of the policies that we have proposed, right? And I think that when we look at the local economy, there's tons of opportunities for us to actually have sustainable, good economies that work for the many and not the few. And I think that that's what is important to make sure that we understand the value of our communities, right? Yeah. And that we don't give it away, right? Or allow others to sell it to the highest bidder.
And address the imbalances
and
that they constantly ignore.
Absolutely. Look, by investing in our local economy and allowing to grow, we see, for instance, communities like Chinatown. I represent the 25th ward. We are the only Chinatown in the country that's growing. And let's look at where we came from and where we are now, right? the Chinatown was at the center of the indictment process when my predecessor was involved, trying to sell a parking lot to a developer. We would have killed the whole Chinatown area. That's unfortunately the fate that many Chinatowns across the country, right, have faced. And until it's important to know the alternative. Look, when we have communities that are thriving and doing well, we have small businesses who are really the backbone of the economy. I mean, talk about the people who really pay their workers well, who have, they keep growing and I think will invest locally. We got to look at the difference between investing on small businesses versus the big corporations and the difference of that and the biggest opportunities. Look at Amazon, like the level of exploitation
you can also see in the gentrification, the character of our neighborhoods are lost.
Absolutely, right.
To all of the corporatization and the franchises that suddenly put out the smaller businesses that are built these neighborhoods.
And it's part of that neoliberal experiment of, exploiting the working people for the extraction of wealth.
Less than a living wage.
Less than living wage. Right now we look at with inflation, with the cost of housing and some of the cost of gas, you name it. And I think that this is the time, but we need to rethink and transform. We clearly see how capitalism and neoliberalism are in crisis. It is not sustainable to continue to subsidize the rich and subsidize corporations at this level. I mean, some of these billionaires are more interested in going to Mars than actually look at the issues that we live.
Can you imagine the ego related to, I want to look at Mars instead of, do you know how many people would worship you if you used your billions to eliminate homelessness? Feed everybody.
Absolutely.
Right? It's mind-boggling, the disconnect. But when they've got that much money, they're not living or suffering the lives that other people are dealing with.
Exactly. And that's what we cannot allow these billionaires and corporations, because they are running government. No doubt about it. I mean, we see between the two parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, they both fail entirely to really address the issues at hand. I mean, Medicare for all is something that is entirely it's a no-brainer, it's possible. It can be, easily paid for.
But the pharmaceutical companies, the pharmaceutical cartel and the insurance companies it's going to cut them off.
Exactly. So these big industries that take over government, there's lobbyists. I mean, the level of lobbying and the power that these corporations have reached, despicable levels, right? When, the price of insulin, the price of basic medication is obscene. I mean,
it's the corporate states of America. Because our representation, we don't have representation. All of the corporations have the representation because they're paying the lobbyists all the money to influence our lawmakers and our representatives. I don't call them our leaders because they're supposed to represent us, but they feel that they're leaders, and they're not leading. They're only representing the people who are paying them off. It's payoffs.
Yeah,
it's legal payoffs. Is what it is.
Bribery.
Legalized bribery.
I mean, look. For instance, I think for something that and I guess the ethics package that the mayor ended up watering down even further. Had basic provisions, right? For instance, to address the issue of subcontractors, namely the casino contracts.
Right, of course.
To make sure that we start, cutting the incentives for corruption, right? The bribery schemes that are being legalized, right? Campaign contributions that completely have conflict of interest, right? Look, the tragedy of all, I mean, when it comes about the casino vote, right? The city of Chicago chooses the casino operator that has the biggest trouble. I mean, we look at it, the ethics concerns, and even later on, a few weeks after that, Wall Street publishes that Bally's is having some issues of, financial.
But their down payment helped cover, what was it, some of the, what was the down payment? I saw a week later after they made their down payment, it was going towards the, it goes to the pension funds.
The pension funds,
the
right.
pension funds,
So, and again, when they sell this idea about, we have to do this for the pensions and all that, first of all, we should never put our pensions connected, with a predatory industry to begin with.
Of course not.
And the projections and all that, because at the end of the day, you ended up with predatory practices.
And the crime that's going to come from the casino.
Right. I mean, common sense. But when you have those already red flags coming in, right? And we know that this industry, and again, we were asking basic questions. That's what we listened to our constituents in the 25th ward. This was actually going to happen in the 78 side, with Related had an application, and it was almost moving that way. But we listened to our constituents. 8 out of 10, 80% of the subjects said we do not want it.
And the mayor's tone deaf to it. You're there to represent the people in your ward, present their concerns, to which Mayor Lightfoot is completely tone deaf and ignores it because she's a dictator.
Right, no.
I mean, she rules like a monarchy. And this is the big, I mean, we've been talking about this on our YouTube show for the past year. I mean, I admit I voted for her because she bamboozled a lot of us. She ran as a progressive and a reformer, and suddenly she showed her neoliberal colors. She was a chameleon. She will say everything and stand for nothing, as I also like to say about Kamala Harris. But yeah, I mean, it's tragic because it's in the case of, like, I know this isn't your word, but NASCAR, she didn't consult with any of the older people and how it's going to impact not only businesses, but just living, cars flying around.
Right. I mean,
you know,
they're talking about that this
residential area.
Right. They're going to talk about take over the Grand Park for several days. During July 4th. During July 4th, that they're going to bring, you know, I think a crowd that they say comparable to what Lollapalooza brings. So, I mean, talking about the need to make sure that we coordinate those efforts, right? That make sure that, and the same thing with the casino. We have a responsibility. Mayor Lightfoot talks about fiduciary responsibility all the time.
Yeah.
But when it comes to actually practicing that,
no. And then we don't have any money. All the money that's coming in from Lollapalooza and everything else, but we can't reopen the mental health clinics. We can't invest in youth centers, as another activist, Jamal Green, has been lobbying forever. He's got some good ideas about being able to invest in youth centers to provide a diversion for kids who unfortunately don't have a familial structure. Yep. Because it's a cycle of generational poverty. It's like you don't have parents that know better to be able to divert them into better. So great, we have to take some responsibility in investing in the communities and hopefully also providing other opportunities for kids where they don't see it to keep them away from the lure of potential gang life or anything else.
The best way we know that, all the research indicates that, you know, early interventions, you know, investments in the schools, investing in early childhood, investing in programming in our school districts, programming in park districts works. Mental health services. Look, right now in Laredo Hospital, up to, you know, maybe hopefully has improved, but a few months ago, you know, the waiting list for an appointment for a mental health service, critical mental health service, was 9 months. 9 months.
I think mental health is at the heart of how you start to preemptively prevent crime.
Absolutely. Look,
right? Because if you're able to like provide that in communities, so much of what we see with crime and I think mental health is also, unfortunately, it's something that people don't want to talk about. It's like a shameful thing. And it's like, no, you provide mental health services for everybody, you're going to have a much better society. So when you had people like Emmanuel shut down the clinics and we don't have any funding to like reopen them or add more, but we're throwing more money at the police.
Like that's going to solve our problems.
Hiring more police, arresting more people. It's like there'd be less people to arrest if you started. Not defunding the police does not mean anarchy and eliminate the police. It means redivert funds. And I hope a lot of people understand that, because defund the police was a really bad term to use. It's more like, let's allocate resources better than just throwing it all at the police, because we have a very, very reactive society in Chicago when it comes to fighting crime. And it's like, if you create solutions preemptively, hopefully you won't have as many criminals or as many desperate people attracted by that.
Look, Mayor Lightfoot understands very well. I mean, like, she did a whole poverty summit, right? When she talked about all these strategies, things that we need to do. You know, we have solutions in terms of, you know, housing instability, right? Which is a big problem in the city. You know, homeless has reached, you know, tragic levels, you know.
It's an epidemic.
It's an epidemic.
Everywhere you go.
And then look, you know, I mean, do we want to end up with what's going on in the West Coast, you know, what's happening in other cities? You know, I think we're close. So, and this is the time, you know, because look, in the 25th ward, what we have done is not being shy away or actually implementing policy that works. So that's what we bought. I mean, we bought one of the largest sites for affordable housing on 18th and Peoria, a site that was almost a certainty to go for luxury housing. You know, there was a legal challenge. We took it on. We did our due diligence, and we ended up settling so that we can buy the lots and not develop 500 perhaps, or I don't know, 400 to 400 plus affordable housing units. So public investment can work, and does work. You know, that's stiff dollars used now to create the housing that we need. We need to invest in mental health clinics. There's no doubt about that. You know, investing in public services will yield a better results than what we have right now. Preemptively investing in public health in our schools. But, you know, we have moved in the opposite direction. Look at the tragedy with the federal funding, the billions of dollars that we receive from the federal government. Some of them are even not accounted for. A lot of money, you know, was allocated for police overtime and other, you know, and other expenses that now, after the fact, shown to have not shown the results that they were projected. So I think that we live in a time where we actually gotta take. We cannot follow this narrative where, you know, the parties, both parties who serve capitalist interest, and this narrative of corporations and billionaires to basically take us away from government. That government is a failure. That government doesn't work or doesn't or is not useful. But those are the safety nets that we have, and representation does matter. In fact, I think a lesson from the 60s is that representation matters, but it's not enough. Yeah. We not only need representatives, right, that are there to help us, but I think it's critical that we have also organization outside of the electoral politics. Again, not only elected officials, but also we need institutions that work for the creation of these safety nets. I think that there's not enough participation. I think that the last election, the 17% turnout, is an indictment on the system.
Absolutely.
That people are saying this is not only enough, but this is not acceptable. So I think that we're starting to reach those levels. The concern, though, with that is that this opens the gate to right-wing extremism, because they're being polarized to come out and vote. So I think that this is the time, for action.
There is so much more I wanted to talk to you about, because I know we've basically analyzed a big part of the problems, and I think we've kind of touched upon the solutions. Perhaps we can have you back again in the future to talk more about solutions, because I think that this is such a larger conversation to unwrap that we can't unfortunately cover in just 27 minutes. And also I wanted to ask you a little more about your personal life, but as an alderperson, but hopefully we'll get to that in the future. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our audience for joining us here on our CANTV edition of Chicago Corner. You can always find us at Chicago Corner on YouTube. Please tune into our show there. Hopefully we'll also have the alderman there to speak more on the issues as we go into the next electoral season. And remember, if it's happening on the streets, you'll hear about it here on Chicago Corner. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. If you would like to be a guest on Chicago Corner, please email our host, Jerry, at chicagocorner.tv.